History has given us heroes, people we've been taught to admire and revere. But what if the truth behind these so-called heroes was darker than we could ever imagine? What if the men and women we've celebrated built their legacies on violence, betrayal, and cruelty? In this video, we'll uncover the shocking truth behind 45 figures whose monstrous actions have been conveniently erased from history. Prepare to have everything you thought you knew turned upside down. Chapter 1. The conqueror who erased entire civilizations. He's celebrated as one of the greatest military minds in history, a conqueror whose empire stretched across continents. They say he was a genius on the battlefield, revered for his strategic brilliance. But behind the crown of glory lies a far darker truth. His so-called victories weren't just about military supremacy. They were about destruction on a scale few can imagine. Entire civilizations were obliterated, cultures erased, and millions slaughtered, all in the name of empire building. His conquests weren't just wars, they were massacres. And while history hails him as a hero, the forgotten voices of those he wiped out remain silenced. The true cost of his so-called greatness is buried beneath layers of myth. The legacy he left wasn't one of victory, it was a landscape of death and despair, where the innocent were nothing more than collateral damage in a game of power and control. What he left behind was far more monstrous than the world ever realised. Retention hook. But this conqueror wasn't the only one hiding atrocities behind a heroic mask. Next, we'll uncover the dark truth behind a philanthropist who built her fortune on exploitation. Chapter 2. The philanthropist who built her empire on exploitation. She was hailed as a symbol of generosity, the face of charity, and an inspiration to millions. This philanthropist built a global empire, using her wealth to fund projects that were praised as life-changing. Her name was synonymous with kindness. But behind her polished image was a ruthless businesswoman, profiting from the very people she claimed to help. For every dollar she donated, there were countless others being exploited in her factories, her supply chains, and her businesses. While the world celebrated her donations, she was quietly stripping away the dignity of those who worked for her. These were people who lived in poverty, working long hours under brutal conditions, with no rights or protections. She hid the truth behind smiles and photo ops, perpetuating the myth of benevolence, while fueling the machine that oppressed the most vulnerable. The wealth she gave away was nothing compared to the lives she destroyed to build it. Retention hook. But her exploitation was just the beginning. Next, we dive into the horrors left behind by a general whose victories came at a horrifying cost. Chapter 3. The general who left a trail of genocide. A military genius, this general was celebrated as a hero who led his nation to victory after victory. His tactics were studied in military academies, and his name was synonymous with bravery and honour. But beneath his lauded reputation lay a blood-soaked legacy. His conquests weren't just about battlefield victories, they were massacres. Entire populations were slaughtered in his wake. Civilians, women, children, countless innocent lives caught in his unrelenting pursuit of power. His campaigns were built on the brutal subjugation and systematic extermination of entire communities. While history books hailed him as a national hero, the truth was buried under layers of propaganda. The destruction he caused wasn't just physical. It wiped out cultures, languages, and entire ways of life. The general didn't just conquer territories, he annihilated everything in his path, all in the name of empire. The horrors he inflicted were hidden, but they still haunt the regions he liberated. Retention hook. But the path of destruction didn't stop there. Next, we'll expose a so-called champion of freedom who enslaved his own people. Chapter 4. The champion of freedom. Who enslaved his people. Hailed as the liberator of his nation, this figure was worshipped as a symbol of freedom and justice. His speeches sparked revolutions, and his promises of liberty resonated with the oppressed. But once he seized power, his actions told a different story. The very freedom he promised was never delivered. Instead of creating a society based on equality, he built a dictatorship where dissent was crushed and his opponents were silenced. His fight against tyranny turned into tyranny itself. Under his rule, the people he claimed to save were enslaved by a system that mirrored the very oppression they had fought against. His vision of freedom was nothing more than a power grab, masked by the illusion of benevolence. The freedom he once fought for was twisted into a tool to consolidate his power, keeping the population in chains, both figuratively and literally. His legacy of freedom was just a lie designed to keep him in control. Retention hook. But his betrayal wasn't unique. Another visionary claimed to bring progress, but his idea of advancement led to the destruction of entire cultures. Chapter 5. The visionary who destroyed cultures in the name of progress. This figure was hailed as one of the greatest minds of his time, a visionary who brought the world into a new era. His ideas were revolutionary, transforming entire societies and shaping the future of nations. But the price of his so-called progress was far steeper than anyone could have imagined. In the name of advancement, he destroyed entire cultures, forcing indigenous peoples to abandon their traditions, beliefs, and ways of life. His vision of the future wasn't just about innovation, it was about erasure. Communities that had thrived for centuries were forced into conformity, their identities wiped out in the pursuit of a better world. He didn't build a society based on mutual growth. He imposed a system that crushed the diversity that once flourished. The so-called progress he brought wasn't about the betterment of humanity. It was a conquest of culture, one that left entire peoples lost and broken in its wake. Retention hook. But this visionary wasn't the only one rewriting history. Next, we'll uncover the educator who reshaped minds, but at a devastating cost. Chapter 6. The educator who silenced dissent and shaped minds with lies. This educator was revered as a titan of intellectual thought, his ideas shaping generations of scholars and thinkers. He was seen as a guiding light for those seeking truth, wisdom, and enlightenment. But beneath the surface, his teachings weren't about truth at all. He crafted an education system designed to suppress free thought and silence any voices of dissent. His lectures weren't an invitation to question the world. They were tools of indoctrination, designed to bend minds to his will. For every student who left his classroom, they did so not as free thinkers, but as pawns in a grand, ideological game. Any who dared challenge him found themselves blacklisted or silenced, their ideas crushed under the weight of his influence. His education was nothing more than a means of control, shaping society into a version of reality that suited his own narrow vision. The truth was buried beneath layers of manipulation, retention, hook. But controlling minds wasn't enough for him. Next, we'll reveal the story of a leader who ruled through fear and bloodshed to secure his power. Chapter 7. The leader who ruled through fear and bloodshed. This leader was praised for his decisive actions and ability to unify a nation under his rule. His strength was seen as a symbol of national pride, and his leadership was envied by many. But the strength he wielded wasn't just about wisdom or strategy. It was built on fear. His rule was one of terror, where dissenters were punished with violence, and entire populations lived under the constant threat of his wrath. His power wasn't earned through respect. It was taken by force. Every decision he made was steeped in brutality, designed to crush any opposition before it could grow. His military wasn't a force for defense. It was a tool of oppression. His so-called unification came at the cost of countless lives, with entire communities silenced or eliminated in the pursuit of absolute control. The man who was called a saviour was, in fact, a tyrant. Retention hook. But fear can't keep power forever. Another leader, this time a statesman, manipulated lives for political gain. What was his true cost? Chapter 8. The statesman who sacrificed lives for political gain. This statesman was revered as a brilliant diplomat, someone who brought his country to new heights through his leadership. His policies were seen as visionary, his strategies heralded as masterful. But his true agenda was far darker. Beneath the veil of diplomacy, he was willing to sacrifice countless lives to secure his own political future. The lives of innocent civilians were treated as pawns in a game of power, their suffering ignored as long as it served his agenda. Wars were waged not for justice or freedom, but for political leverage, all while the world saw him as a hero. He built alliances not out of goodwill, but to further his control. The human cost of his political manoeuvres was staggering, but the public remained unaware of the devastation he left in his wake. To him, power was the ultimate goal, no matter the price. Retention, hook. But this wasn't the only instance of power being built on broken lives. Next, we'll uncover a revolutionary who became the very tyrant he sought to overthrow. Chapter 9. The revolutionary who created a new tyranny. This revolutionary was hailed as a hero, a man who fought for the oppressed, vowing to overthrow the corrupt systems that kept the people in chains. His name was whispered as the future of freedom, and his rise was seen as a beacon of hope. But once he seized power, everything changed. The man who promised liberty became the very thing he fought against. The very system of oppression he vowed to destroy became his own tool of tyranny. Those who once followed him were now silenced, and anyone who dared to question his rule was branded a traitor. His revolution had replaced one form of dictatorship with another. The hope he once inspired became a nightmare, as his thirst for power eclipsed any ideals of freedom. The people who believed in him were left disillusioned, trapped under the rule of the very man who had promised to liberate them. Retention hook. But this wasn't the only case of hope being betrayed. There's another figure, a scientist who used human lives as experiments for personal gain. Chapter 10. The scientist who experimented on humans for glory. A brilliant mind, this scientist was seen as a pioneer, celebrated for his groundbreaking work that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. His discoveries were lauded as some of the greatest advancements in science, and he became a symbol of intellectual progress. But behind his accolades lay a horrifying truth. His success was built on the suffering of innocent people. He used human subjects, often unwilling and unknowing, subjecting them to cruel and inhumane experiments. Their pain was seen as nothing more than data, and their lives were sacrificed in the name of progress. His experiments didn't just cross ethical lines, they obliterated them. His quest for glory led to the destruction of countless lives, and the horrors of his work were hidden behind the veneer of scientific achievement. The legacy he left behind was one of death and exploitation, and his greatness was built on the broken bodies of the innocent. Retention. Hook. But his experiments weren't the only horrific legacy hidden behind fame. Next, we uncover the writer who inspired millions, yet lived a life of betrayal and lies. Chapter 11. The statesman who sacrificed lives for political gain. This statesman was celebrated for his diplomatic genius, revered as a man who could unite nations and secure peace in turbulent times. But behind the facade of peace, he was a master manipulator. Every move he made in the political arena had one goal: power. Lives were discarded like pawns on a chessboard, all for the sake of maintaining his position. Wars were sparked, alliances forged, and enemies crushed, all while the world believed he was acting for the greater good. The suffering he caused was swept under the rug, overshadowed by his public image as a peacemaker. People died for his ambitions, lives torn apart by his relentless pursuit of control. What history doesn't reveal is the true cost of his policies. Human lives, sacrificed in the name of political gamesmanship. His legacy was a web of lies, all masked by his carefully crafted image of a statesman who put others first. Retention hook. But this wasn't the only statesman who used lives as currency. In the next chapter, we'll reveal a writer whose words inspired millions, yet hid a dark truth. Chapter 12. The reformer who suppressed the very change he promised. He was the face of change, a reformer who promised to liberate his people from the shackles of corruption. His speeches were fiery, filled with promises of justice, equality, and a new dawn for society. But once in power, those promises evaporated. Instead of reform, he brought repression. The very people who had believed in him found themselves silenced, their dreams of a better future crushed beneath his iron fist. His reforms weren't about uplifting the oppressed, they were about consolidating his power. The same system he vowed to overthrow became the system he relied on to stay in control. The very change he championed was turned against the people, and the freedom he spoke of was replaced by a new tyranny. His legacy became one of betrayal. Not a champion of change, but a man who used the hope of the people to seize power and maintain control. Retention hook. But this man wasn't the only one who became the villain he once opposed. Next, we reveal the scientist who manipulated lives for personal glory. Chapter 13. The revolutionary who created a new tyranny. This revolutionary was the embodiment of hope for the oppressed. He promised freedom, equality, and the dismantling of an unjust system. His rise to power was seen as the dawn of a new era. But once in power, he became what he once despised, an authoritarian. The very people who had fought alongside him found themselves imprisoned, silenced, or executed for even the smallest of transgressions. His so-called revolution was nothing more than a change in leadership, with the same cruel methods of control, only now under his rule. The freedom he promised was a lie, and the justice he sought to deliver became twisted in the hunger for power. The revolution that had once inspired millions turned into a nightmare for those who had believed in it most. His legacy wasn't one of liberation, it was one of tyranny, a cruel irony for a man who once fought to destroy it. Retention hook. But his transformation wasn't the only one. There's another hero who used innocent lives as test subjects in the name of science. Next, we'll uncover his horrific legacy. Chapter 14. The scientist who experimented on humans for glory. A genius, this scientist was hailed as a pioneer, his work considered groundbreaking in the world of medical and scientific advancement. His name became synonymous with progress. Yet behind his fame there was a dark truth. The lives he used for his experiments weren't willing subjects, they were victims. The scientist used human beings, often poor, marginalised or imprisoned, as test subjects for his research, all in the name of scientific glory. Ethical boundaries were completely disregarded as he conducted grisly, inhumane experiments to push the limits of his knowledge. His discoveries weren't the result of noble efforts, they were the product of suffering and exploitation. His fame was built on a foundation of broken lives, and the truth of his methods was buried by the medical community. The lives he destroyed were nothing more than collateral damage in his pursuit of glory. His legacy, once celebrated, now stands as a monument to the dark side of scientific ambition. Retention hook. But his twisted legacy wasn't the only one hidden beneath a facade of brilliance. In the next chapter, we reveal the writer whose words inspired millions, but concealed the worst betrayal. Chapter 15. The writer who exposed lies but lived them himself. This writer was a voice for the voiceless, a champion of truth in an age of lies. His works inspired movements, changed minds, and forced the world to confront uncomfortable realities. His pen was a weapon, sharp and unrelenting, cutting through the myths and deceptions of his time. Yet, in the shadows of his literary fame, he was hiding his own hypocrisy. The same truths he exposed about others were truths he refused to confront about himself. Behind his words was a man who manipulated, deceived, and exploited those closest to him. His life was built on lies, and while he called out the world for its falsehoods, he never held a mirror to his own actions. The man who led others to seek truth was, in fact, a living contradiction, and his personal betrayals were far darker than any of the lies he wrote about. His legacy, built on exposing others, was tainted by his own deceit. Retention. Hook. But this writer wasn't the only one living a lie. Next, we'll explore the architect whose monuments to greatness were built on the suffering of others. Chapter 16. The architect who destroyed communities for a monument. This architect was celebrated for his visionary designs that shaped the skylines of entire cities. His buildings were hailed as masterpieces, symbols of human ingenuity and progress. But behind the grandeur of his monuments, entire communities were displaced and destroyed. In his quest for architectural perfection, he demolished neighbourhoods, uprooting families who had lived there for generations. Homes, businesses, and lives were obliterated in the name of progress. What the world saw as towering symbols of achievement were, in reality, built on the ruins of people's lives. The so-called greater good came at a devastating cost, and the families forced out of their homes were left to fend for themselves. His creations were a testament to his brilliance, but they were also a monument to the suffering he inflicted on the most vulnerable. History might remember him as a genius, but the true cost of his work will never be measured in stone and steel. Retention hook. But this architect's destruction wasn't the only legacy built on the backs of the oppressed. Next, we'll uncover the artist who spread propaganda while ignoring the suffering around him. Chapter 17. The artist who spread propaganda while ignoring the pain. This artist was hailed as a visionary, a man whose work inspired entire generations, shaping culture and influencing politics. His art was seen as a call for change, a reflection of society's deepest truths. But beneath the surface, his work was a tool of propaganda, used to manipulate the masses and conceal the darker realities of the time. His powerful images distracted the public from the suffering and injustice that raged around them, presenting a world that didn't exist. As he painted his masterpieces, he turned a blind eye to the exploitation and pain of the very people he depicted. While the world celebrated his art, those in the margins continued to suffer, their voices silenced by the narrative he created. His legacy wasn't one of truth, but of distraction, an artist who used his talent to hide the real horrors from public view, all while continuing to profit from the lies. Retention hook. But this wasn't the only artist who used their platform to manipulate. Next, we uncover the king who waged war for personal gain, all while claiming to protect his people. Chapter 18. The king who took his people to war for personal gain. This king was hailed as a mighty ruler, a man whose victories were supposed to elevate his kingdom to new heights. He led his people to war, promising glory and prosperity. But what history didn't reveal was the true reason behind his campaigns: personal ambition. The wars he waged were not for the betterment of his people, but for his own ego and thirst for power. Lives were lost, families torn apart, and entire cities ravaged. Yet the king's only concern was his own legacy. His wars weren't about protecting his people. They were about expanding his own empire and securing his place in history. The toll of his decisions was devastating, but the king never had to face the consequences. While the kingdom mourned its losses, he basked in the glory of his supposed victories, leaving a legacy of destruction that his people would pay for generations. Retention hook. But this king's wars weren't the only horrors hidden behind a crown. Next, we'll reveal the doctor who betrayed his oath and used his patience for personal advancement. Chapter 19. The doctor who abused trust in the name of medical advancement. This doctor was once considered a pioneer in his field, praised for his groundbreaking contributions to medicine. His name was synonymous with progress and innovation. But beneath his prestigious reputation was a man who exploited his position for his own benefit. He used his patients as guinea pigs, subjecting them to risky and unapproved medical procedures without their consent, all for the sake of advancing his career. Their pain was nothing more than data points, and their suffering was ignored as he sought recognition and acclaim. His oath to do no harm was forgotten in his quest for glory. The true toll of his actions was buried beneath the praise he received, and those whose lives he destroyed were left in the shadows. His legacy in medicine was forever stained, as his pursuit of greatness came at the expense of those who trusted him with their lives. Retention hook. But this doctor's betrayal wasn't the only one hidden in the halls of greatness. Next, we'll explore the warrior who fought for glory, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. Chapter 20. The warrior who fought for honour, leaving a legacy of cruelty. This warrior was lauded as a hero, a man who fought in battle for honour and glory. His victories were celebrated, his courage immortalised. But behind the tales of valour, there was a darker reality. For this warrior, the battlefield wasn't just about honour, it was about conquest, domination, and cruelty. His victories were built on the suffering of countless innocents. His so-called bravery was nothing more than bloodlust, leaving entire villages destroyed and families torn apart. The glory he received was paid for in pain, with every victory leading to the downfall of another community. While the world hailed him as a hero, the real cost of his actions was hidden from view. His legacy wasn't one of honour, but of destruction, a testament to the lies that had been woven around his reputation. And as history praised him, the people he had destroyed were forgotten. Retention hook. But this warrior wasn't the only one using bloodshed to build a legacy. Next, we'll uncover a diplomat who ignored the suffering behind closed doors for personal gain. Chapter 21. The diplomat who ignored the suffering behind closed doors. This diplomat was celebrated as a master of international relations, a man whose efforts brought peace to war-torn nations. His name was synonymous with negotiation and diplomacy, and he was hailed as the voice of reason in a world filled with chaos. But while the world applauded his achievements, there was a darker side to his work. Behind closed doors, he made deals that ignored the suffering of millions. His focus wasn't on human rights or justice. It was about maintaining his power and influence, no matter the cost. People were sacrificed, their lives used as bargaining chips in his high-stakes political games. The true consequences of his decisions were hidden behind the polite smiles of diplomacy. as he secured his place in history at the expense of the most vulnerable. His legacy wasn't one of peace, it was one of complicity, turning a blind eye to the suffering he could have stopped. Retention hook. But this diplomat wasn't the only one using others as pawns. Next, we'll uncover an industrialist who thrived on human labour and suffering for wealth. Chapter 22. The industrialist who thrived on human labour and suffering. This industrialist was heralded as a visionary, a man who revolutionised the way industries operated, leading his nation into an era of unprecedented prosperity. His factories churned out goods that were sold worldwide, and his name became synonymous with success. But the price of that success was horrifying. His factories were built on the backs of the exploited, where workers were forced to endure gruelling hours, unsafe conditions, and abysmal wages. Entire families were torn apart as they were forced into a cycle of poverty and labour that never ended. The wealth he amassed came from their suffering, yet the world saw only the progress he had brought. His success was built on the dehumanisation of his workers, and the horrors of his empire were hidden behind a veneer of industrial achievement. For every dollar he made, there was a life broken, a body exhausted, and a dream destroyed. Retention. Hook. But this industrialist empire wasn't the only one built on the backs of others. Next, we'll explore the soldier whose victory came at the cost of a nation's soul. Chapter 23. The soldier who saw victory, but left a nation in ruins. This soldier was hailed as a national hero, praised for his leadership and bravery on the battlefield. His victories were celebrated, and his name was etched in the annals of history as one of the greatest military leaders of his time. But while the world focused on his triumphs, the true cost of his victories was hidden. For every battle he won, entire cities were destroyed, and millions of innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. The war he fought wasn't just about glory, it was about devastation, the permanent scars left on the land and its people. The soldier, who was supposed to bring honour to his country, left behind nothing but ruin. His victories were hollow, built on the corpses of the innocent, and in the end, his so-called greatness was nothing more than the ashes of a nation torn apart by the very battles he led. Retention hook. But the soldier wasn't the only one who left devastation in their wake. Next, we'll uncover the president who condemned nations to war for a false sense of democracy. Chapter 24. The president who condemned nations to war for a false sense of democracy. This president was revered as a champion of democracy, praised for his dedication to spreading freedom and liberty across the world. His speeches inspired nations, and he was seen as a beacon of hope for the oppressed. But behind his idealistic rhetoric lay a darker truth. His pursuit of democracy came at the cost of countless lives. Wars were waged in the name of freedom, but they were really about asserting power and control, leaving entire nations in ruins. The president's promise of liberty was nothing more than a guise to justify his imperialistic ambitions. The nations he claimed to liberate were left devastated, their people destroyed by the very wars he instigated. His legacy wasn't one of freedom, it was one of destruction, as he tore apart the very nations he swore to help. What history didn't reveal was that his democracy was built on bloodshed, not ideals. Retention hook. But this president wasn't the only one whose wealth came from blood. In the next chapter, we'll expose a philanthropist who funded wars with blood money. Chapter 25. The philanthropist who funded wars with blood money. This philanthropist was praised for her generosity and humanitarian efforts. She was seen as a beacon of hope, a woman who used her wealth to improve the lives of others. But behind her charitable image was a dark secret. Her fortune came from war. She funded conflicts, supplied weapons, and profited from the destruction of countless lives. While she donated millions to causes and received accolades for her generosity, the true source of her wealth was rooted in the suffering of others. Every donation she made was built on the backs of soldiers and civilians killed in the wars she funded. The world celebrated her as a saviour, but the blood of innocents was on her hands. Her philanthropy wasn't about helping people, it was about maintaining her power and influence, using her money to perpetuate the very conflicts that allowed her to thrive. Retention hook. But her so-called generosity was just the beginning. Next, we'll reveal the poet who inspired movements, but never lived by his own words. Chapter 26. The poet who inspired movements, but never lived by his words. This poet's words ignited revolutions and sparked social change. His verses inspired generations to fight for justice, equality, and freedom. But while his poetry painted a picture of a better world, the man behind the words was a stark contrast. He preached of unity and compassion, yet lived a life of selfish indulgence, betraying the very values he espoused. He used his fame to manipulate those around him, surrounding himself with sycophants while those he promised to uplift continued to suffer. His poetry was a mask, a tool to put on to gather followers, all while avoiding responsibility for the world's injustices. The movements he inspired were built on ideals he never truly believed in, leaving people disillusioned and betrayed. His legacy wasn't one of change, it was one of exploitation, using his powerful words to hide a lifetime of hypocrisy. Retention hook. But the poet wasn't the only one who profited from others' suffering. Next, we'll uncover the emperor who built an empire on the blood of his people. Chapter 27. The emperor who shaped an empire through bloodshed. This emperor was revered as a powerful ruler, a man who expanded his empire to unthinkable heights. His military prowess was unmatched, and his name became synonymous with might and glory. But his empire was built on bloodshed, not brilliance. Every expansion was marked by conquest, with entire populations wiped out or enslaved in the name of progress. His people were subjected to cruelty, forced into labour camps and wars that drained their resources and spirit. While the emperor basked in glory, the price of his success was the suffering of millions. His vision of an empire was forged through terror, and the legacy he left behind was one of broken bodies and shattered lives. The glory of his empire was just a facade, hiding the brutal reality of its creation. History remembers him as a great emperor, but the truth is, his empire was founded on the pain of his own people. Retention hook. But his empire was not the only one built on terror. Next, we uncover the hero who led revolutions, only to betray everyone who believed in him. Chapter 28. The hero who led revolutions but left a trail of betrayal. This hero was once the symbol of hope, leading the charge against oppressive regimes and inspiring millions with promises of freedom and equality. His revolution was seen as the dawn of a new era. But once in power, he betrayed everything he fought for. The same oppression he had condemned became his own tool, used to crush dissent and silence his supporters. Those who had believed in him were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. His vision for a better society was replaced by a reign of terror that mirrored the tyranny he had fought to overthrow. His rise to power wasn't about justice, it was about control. The revolution he led ended in disaster, as the hero who once inspired millions became the very monster he sought to destroy. His betrayal left his followers broken, their dreams of freedom shattered. Retention hook. But his betrayal wasn't the only one that history has buried. In the next chapter, we reveal the investor who built his empire on the backs of the suffering poor. Chapter 29. The investor who built wealth on human exploitation. This investor was the epitome of success, hailed as a visionary who revolutionized the business world. He was praised for his keen eye and ability to build wealth from nothing. But the foundation of his empire was exploitation. He made his fortune by profiting from the labour of the poor, setting up sweatshops and exploiting workers who had no choice but to endure grueling conditions. He never cared for the people who made him rich. Their lives were nothing more than commodities to be used and discarded. While he amassed a fortune, those who worked for him were trapped in poverty, with no hope of escape. His wealth wasn't built on innovation or hard work. It was built on the backs of those who suffered for his success. The truth behind his riches was hidden by his carefully crafted public image, but it was the suffering of others that made him one of the wealthiest men alive. Retention hook. But this investor's empire wasn't the only one built on cruelty. Next, we'll uncover the leader who inspired loyalty through fear and manipulation. Chapter 30. The leader who inspired loyalty but built a foundation of fear. This leader was praised for his charisma and strength, admired for his ability to unite people and lead them toward greatness. His speeches were filled with promises of prosperity, and his image was that of a hero who fought for his people. But beneath the surface, he built his empire on fear. He didn't lead through respect, he led through intimidation, manipulating his followers into blind loyalty. Those who dared to question him were swiftly crushed, their lives ruined for the smallest of offences. His success wasn't a result of true leadership, but of an iron fist that kept everyone in check. He ruled with a false sense of unity, while his subjects lived in constant fear of his wrath. His legacy wasn't built on the admiration of his people, but on their fear of his power. The true cost of his reign was hidden behind the loyalty he forced from others. Retention hook. But this leader's reign of terror wasn't the only one that shaped history. Next, we'll uncover the pioneer who destroyed nature in the name of progress. Chapter 31. The pioneer who destroyed nature for progress. This pioneer was celebrated as a visionary, a man who brought new technologies and innovations that shaped the future of the world. His inventions were seen as revolutionary, and he was hailed as a hero of progress. But the price of his so-called advancements was devastating. His work led to the destruction of entire ecosystems, causing irreparable damage to nature. Forests were cleared, wildlife was wiped out, and rivers were poisoned, all in the name of progress. The benefits of his inventions came at the expense of the environment, and the true cost of his so-called advancements was hidden from the public. While he pushed humanity forward, he left behind a legacy of environmental destruction. The land that had once thrived was forever scarred by his vision of progress. His legacy wasn't one of innovation, it was one of exploitation, where the earth itself paid the price for his success. Retention hook. But this pioneer's legacy wasn't the only one that left the planet in ruins. Next, we'll uncover the king who waged war for personal gain while hiding behind a crown. Chapter 32. The king who used faith as a tool to control his people. This king was hailed as a divine ruler, a man who used his religious authority to unite and lead his people. His reign was marked by his deep faith, which seemed to guide every decision he made. But what history often fails to reveal is how he twisted religion to consolidate his power. He manipulated his people into believing that his rule was divinely ordained, using faith as a weapon to silence opposition. Those who challenged him were branded heretics, their voices drowned out by the force of his religious decree. The king didn't rule by justice or merit, he ruled by fear, masking his tyranny behind the divine right to govern. His reign wasn't about spiritual leadership, it was about control, using the trust and devotion of his people as a means to keep them subjugated. While he appeared to be a man of faith, his actions betrayed the very ideals he claimed to uphold. Retention hook. But this king's manipulation wasn't the only one hidden in the name of religion. Next, we'll explore a commander who justified war with patriotism, masking his own monstrous intentions. Chapter 33. The commander who hid his war crimes under patriotism. This commander was celebrated as a hero, a man who led his country through one of its most difficult wars. His bravery was admired, his strategic mind praised as he guided his troops to victory. But beneath his image of patriotism, he was a man who committed war crimes that stained his legacy. His victories weren't just about military prowess, they were about cruelty, taking lives without remorse, committing atrocities in the name of duty. While the world hailed him as a national hero, his soldiers ravaged civilian populations, burned villages, and ignored the laws of war. The patriotism he preached was nothing more than a smokescreen, hiding the brutal acts he committed. His actions, justified as necessary for victory, left a legacy of pain and destruction. The truth behind his heroic leadership was buried, and the people whose lives were ruined were left to suffer in silence. Retention hook. But this commander wasn't the only one who used patriotism as a shield for evil. In the next chapter, we'll uncover the visionary who bent reality for personal control. Chapter 34. The visionary who altered reality for personal control. This visionary was revered for his bold ideas that changed the course of history. He was a man ahead of his time, someone who challenged the status quo and reshaped society's very foundation. But his vision wasn't about the betterment of humanity. It was about manipulating reality to suit his needs. He used his influence to distort facts, suppress the truth, and control the narrative. What he didn't create through innovation, he built through deceit. His so-called progress was really just a series of mind games designed to control the thoughts and beliefs of those around him. The people who followed him didn't know they were being led into a world where truth and lies were interchangeable. His so-called genius was built on a foundation of manipulation, and the future he created was one in which reality itself was shaped by his desires. What history remembers as progress was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. Retention. Hook. But this visionary's manipulation wasn't the only one that left a trail of destruction. Next, we'll uncover the general who sacrificed his soldiers for empire expansion. Chapter 35. The general who sacrificed the innocent for empire expansion. This general was hailed as a war hero, his campaigns seen as the epitome of military brilliance. His strategies were studied, his victories celebrated, and his name was etched in the history books as a man who expanded his nation's borders with unmatched skill. But behind his triumphs was a ruthless leader who sacrificed the lives of his own soldiers and innocent civilians for the sake of expansion. The price of his victories was devastating, with entire populations wiped out to secure new territories. He cared little for the lives lost in the pursuit of glory. His only concern was the empire he was building. His conquests weren't about defending his people. They were about greed, the thirst for power, and a hunger to leave behind a legacy of dominance. The soldiers he sent into battle were mere pawns, and the innocents caught in the crossfire were nothing more than collateral damage in his pursuit of empire. Retention hook. But this general wasn't the only one whose empire came at a deadly cost. Next, we'll reveal the dictator who used fear to solidify his control over millions. Chapter 36. The philosopher who advocated freedom but enslaved others. This philosopher's words echoed through history, inspiring generations to fight for freedom, equality, and justice. His ideas laid the groundwork for revolutions and social movements. Yet, while he preached liberation, he practiced the exact opposite. Behind the veil of his intellectual brilliance, he owned slaves, treating them as property, while expounding on ideals of liberty. His personal life was a stark contrast to his theories, and his hypocrisy was buried beneath his philosophical fame. He argued for the freedom of all people, but he turned a blind eye to the suffering of those he enslaved, perpetuating a system of oppression that he never challenged in his own life. He justified his actions, claiming that his personal contradictions didn't diminish the greatness of his ideas. But history cannot forgive such hypocrisy. The very man who wrote about freedom was, in reality, complicit in the enslavement of others. His legacy, marked by intellectual achievements, is now tainted by the very system he claimed to oppose. Retention hook. But his betrayal wasn't the only dark truth, hidden beneath a philosopher's mask. Next, we'll uncover a priest who preached mercy but enforced violence. Chapter 37. The priest who preached mercy but enforced violence. This priest was regarded as a spiritual leader, a man who guided his followers with the promise of mercy, kindness, and salvation. His words were full of compassion, urging his flock to forgive and love. Yet his actions were the exact opposite. He used his position of power to enforce brutal punishments on those who disagreed with him, all in the name of faith. His merciful sermons were contradicted by his violent enforcement of religious doctrine. Those who dared to challenge him or his teachings were ostracized, tortured, or killed, all under the banner of divine right. His church was not a place of refuge, but a system of control, wielding fear and cruelty as tools of domination. While he preached forgiveness, he never extended it to those who questioned or opposed him. His legacy is one of hypocrisy, a man who used religion as a shield for violence. The world remembers him as a spiritual guide, but the truth reveals him as a tyrant. Retention. Hook. But this priest's reign of terror wasn't the only one to mask itself as divine. Next, we'll uncover an empress who built her dynasty on the backs of the oppressed. Chapter 38. The empress who built her dynasty on the backs of the oppressed. This empress is remembered as one of the most powerful women in history, her reign marked by grandeur and prosperity. She expanded her empire to incredible heights, securing a legacy that would last for centuries. But the prosperity she claimed to bring was built on the backs of the oppressed. Her empire thrived on the exploitation of enslaved people, many of whom were forced to work in brutal conditions to sustain the wealth of the ruling elite. Under her reign, entire populations were subjected to forced labour, their lives a commodity to build her wealth. She used her power not to uplift her people, but to solidify her position, amassing vast wealth through the suffering of others. While the world saw her as a wise and fair ruler, the truth is that her dynasty was founded on exploitation and cruelty. The empire she left behind was one of oppression, and the legacy she built came at the expense of countless lives. Retention hook. But this empress wasn't the only one using the oppressed to build an empire. Next, we'll uncover an inventor who sold dreams built on the broken. Chapter 39. The inventor. Who sold dreams built on the broken. This inventor was hailed as a visionary, his creations revolutionizing industries and changing the world. He became a symbol of human ingenuity, someone who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But what the world didn't know was the cost of his success. His inventions weren't just born from brilliance, they were born from the exploitation of workers, many of whom endured grueling conditions to bring his ideas to life. The factories that produced his innovations were rife with child labour, dangerous working environments, and long hours for little pay. His dream of progress was built on the backs of the vulnerable, people whose lives were sacrificed to fuel his success. While he was celebrated for his accomplishments, the human toll of his work was hidden from the public eye. The legacy he left behind wasn't one of progress, it was one of human suffering, masked by the brilliance of his creations. Retention hook. But this inventor's dream wasn't the only one built on exploitation. Next, we'll reveal a ruler who used faith to control his people and manipulate history. Chapter 40. The ruler who used faith as a tool to control his people. This ruler was revered as a religious leader, seen as a divine figure who governed with the wisdom and authority granted to him by the gods. His reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and the promise of salvation. Yet, his rule was built on manipulation. He used the power of religion to control his people, wielding faith as a weapon to keep them subjugated. His laws were said to be divinely inspired, and anyone who defied him was accused of blasphemy. His people lived in fear of both his political and religious power, unable to distinguish between the will of the gods and his own desires. Behind the image of a benevolent ruler, he was a tyrant, using religion to justify cruelty and control. His kingdom wasn't one of enlightenment, it was one of oppression, with faith twisted into a tool of domination, keeping his subjects loyal out of fear, not devotion. Retention hook. But this ruler's divine manipulation wasn't the only one hidden beneath a crown. Next, we'll uncover the commander who sacrificed soldiers for the expansion of his empire. Chapter 41. The commander who sacrificed soldiers for his glory. This commander was celebrated as one of the greatest military leaders, a man who led his troops to victory after victory. His name became synonymous with bravery and tactical brilliance. But beneath his hero's facade was a cold, calculating leader who viewed his soldiers as expendable. The lives of his men were mere stepping stones to his glory. He led them into battles that had little strategic value, where the only outcome was senseless loss. His quest for personal glory outweighed any consideration for the men he commanded. As long as the victories came, he was content, regardless of the cost in human lives. His soldiers were sent to die for a cause that was never truly theirs, with little regard for their families or futures. While history remembered him as a hero, his true legacy was one of wasted lives, all in the pursuit of personal power and fame. Retention hook. But this commander's reckless ambition wasn't the only one that left devastation in its wake. Next, we'll explore a king who used war as a tool for personal gain. Chapter 42. The king who used war as a tool for personal gain. This king was heralded as a wise ruler, a man who fought for his people and defended his nation from foreign invaders. But his wars weren't about protecting his people. They were about expanding his own wealth and influence. His battles were carefully orchestrated to benefit him personally, using the blood of his soldiers and the suffering of his subjects as means to an end. He waged wars not out of necessity, but out of greed, seeking to amass more land, power and treasure. His citizens, who believed in his nobility, were sent to fight for his ambitions, their lives sacrificed for his personal gain. The so-called victories brought glory to him, but left his nation weakened and torn apart. His legacy was built on the backs of the innocent, and the people who trusted him were left to pay the price of his lust for power. Retention hook. But this king's hunger for control wasn't the only one that tore apart a nation. Next, we'll uncover a celebrity who used fame to mask their darkest truths. Chapter 43. The celebrity who used fame to mask cruelty. This celebrity was adored by millions, their name a symbol of success, talent, and beauty. The world saw them as a shining star, an icon of perfection and grace. But behind the glamorous exterior was a much darker reality. The celebrity used their fame to hide their cruelty and manipulative behaviour, treating those around them with disdain, while maintaining a carefully crafted image of kindness. Their wealth and status were built on the exploitation of others, and the world was blind to the true nature of the person behind the public persona. While millions adored them, the people who worked for them, who were closest to them, suffered in silence. Their fame was a shield that protected them from accountability, allowing them to hide the darkest parts of their soul. The truth about their cruelty was buried beneath layers of glamour and admiration. Retention hook. But this celebrity's deception wasn't the only one masked by fame. In the next chapter, we'll uncover the diplomat who ignored the suffering of millions for personal gain. Chapter 44. The diplomat who ignored the suffering of millions for political gain. This diplomat was celebrated as a master negotiator, a man who brokered peace deals that changed the course of history. His ability to bring opposing forces together was lauded as a rare talent, one that brought him global acclaim. But beneath the surface, his negotiations were never about peace. They were about power. The people he made deals with were never his priority. His political ambitions were. Entire populations were sacrificed to secure his personal gain, with millions suffering as a result of his so-called peace talks. His decisions, cloaked in the language of diplomacy, were made to benefit the few, leaving the powerless to suffer in silence. He didn't care about the human cost, only about advancing his career. While the world praised him for his achievements, he left behind a legacy of broken promises and unresolved pain. His diplomacy was built on deceit, and his legacy was one of manipulation. Retention. Hook. But this diplomat's games weren't the only ones hidden behind a smile. In the next chapter, we'll expose a poet whose words inspired, but whose actions betrayed. Chapter 45. The poet who inspired, but betrayed. This poet's works are still read today, inspiring generations to fight for justice, freedom, and truth. His verses became a rallying cry for those seeking change, his words a beacon of hope in times of darkness. But the poet who inspired millions also betrayed them. His personal life was filled with contradictions, as he profited from the very systems he railed against. While he encouraged his followers to challenge oppression, he turned a blind eye to the suffering of those who made his success possible. The poet lived a life of indulgence, using his fame to manipulate and exploit others, all while championing the causes of the oppressed. His legacy was built on a lie. The man who claimed to fight for justice was, in fact, a hypocrite who failed to live by his own ideals. The world admired his words, but the truth behind his actions was far more sinister. Final payoff. Throughout history, we've been taught to revere these figures, heroes who built legacies that seemed noble, virtuous, and just. But the truth is far more disturbing. Behind the facades of glory, power, and prestige, these so-called heroes were monsters in disguise. Their legacies were built on exploitation, cruelty, and betrayal. They manipulated the world to suit their own ambitions, leaving behind a trail of suffering that history conveniently ignored. Their actions weren't the marks of greatness. They were the stains of tyranny, oppression, and deceit. And the truth, once buried, is now coming to light. These figures were not the paragons we've been told about. They were the villains of their own time, and we were taught to glorify them. Now, as we uncover their hidden crimes, we must ask ourselves, what other heroes are we still blind to? And how many more dark truths have been forgotten?